it was a real honor to be asked to present at the Boys School Conference this summer, and I think what you're about to see, you'll recognize some of it from things that we've talked about in past years. It's one of the reasons I wanted to present about it at the Boys School Conference. We split it up amongst the three of us, and in order to provide some perspective, we introduced ourselves. So I'm Marc Ardisson. I'm the Director of Technology at Montgomery Bell Academy. I'll be 47 years old next week. I have 3 children who are 29, 24, and 19. I do not teach a class at Montgomery Bell Academy. And what we want to talk about is connecting with the digital generation. There we go. It's no secret that the digital skill set of students in our classroom differs from that of the teachers providing instruction. What we want to highlight today is the gap and focus on the issue of preparing our boys to be successful in a digital world. And I want to talk just a few minutes about some of these things. So we talk about digital natives versus digital immigrants. How many of you are born 1980 and newer? All right, so you would technically be considered digital natives. If you're born before 1980, you'd be considered a digital immigrant. There are a lot of charts that you can find online that try to define different generations. It's very hard to find more than one that are consistent. But essentially it is that, you know, if you're generation Y, Z, or beyond, you're a digital native. If you're born before that, you'd be considered a digital immigrant. This is a nice chart that breaks down some things based on generations, and then also some things that are important to each of those generations. I found it very fun to look at these in particular. How you get around, you know, we've got the Gen Z, Mom's Prius. Deepest fear is one of my favorites. You know, the greatest generation, the world in 2016, so their greatest fear, baby boomers, no longer center of attention. What about my generation? Paying off loan debt or low batteries, right? Greatest fear in life. Very good with this? You guys have seen this before, but I wanted to throw it out there again. The folks at the Boys School Conference hadn't seen it. Help me fill in the blanks. Students today depend on what too much? They don't know how to. They can't. What will they do when? Right? So let's answer that question 200 years ago. Or maybe 100 years ago. Or fast forward just a little bit. It's not my favorite. I probably would have taken this slide out. All right, so who are the digital natives? The boys we teach have lived their entire lives with instant access to information. Technology has always been present in their lives. Our boys believe that the school environment should closely resemble their non-school environment. They expect digital learning tools to be thoroughly integrated into their education and believe that they should be able to seamlessly connect their academic experiences to personal experiences through these same tools. They assume that these learning tools will be available to them at all times, because for them, learning isn't limited to the classroom. It's something that can take place at any time, in any location. Today's boys take for granted having access to the internet, computers, smartphones, digital messaging, etc. There has never been a time when these digital wonders haven't existed, and they haven't just adopted the technology, it's part of their DNA. They have access to hundreds of television stations, thousands of online radio stations and music services, and billions of web pages, just a few more than you and I had at their age. They have instant virtual access to nearly every library, art gallery, and museum in the world. These boys watch world events as they happen. They see history in the making. This digital generation operates at twitch speed and accepts instantaneous access to information, goods, and services as the norm. They expect to be able to communicate with anyone at any time from anywhere. It has led to the death of patience and has fueled their demand for instant gratification. They expect interactive information, resources, and communication. They want relevant, real-life experiences. They use technology transparently, without thinking about it, marveling about it, or wondering how it works. This is the first generation to master the tools essential to society. I did that there too, didn't I? Before older generations. So one more time. This is the first generation to master the tools essential to society before older generations. Digital is their first language. They are the digital generation. And then this is a chart of how digital native learners prefer to learn. All right, who are the digital immigrants? Most people from our generation don't speak digital as a first language. We come from a non-digital world. We speak digital as a second language, and we do that with varying degrees of skill. Like all immigrants, some of us are better at learning and adapting to the ways of the new landscape. Some of us have caught on quickly and thrived, while others struggle to apply old thinking to new ways of doing things. Because of our lower tech upbringing, we have held on to our more traditional assumptions about the world. We still naturally desire to have a voice conversation, read the manual to learn information, or to print out a report to edit it. People of our generation are afraid of breaking the device or sequence. The digital generation has no fear of breaking it and knows that there's a way to reset it. And this will show you how we digital immigrants prefer to teach. How can we best determine which generational shifts are most valuable to embrace, and how should we do so? Is a mutually beneficial environment even possible? Our boys are growing into adulthood in a totally different world than experienced by their teachers. And in order to provide an engaging environment, understanding their reality and integrating appropriate technology into the learning environment is a must. As we work to achieve an ideal balance between technology and teaching, we must pursue a solution that prepares students for their future, not our past. We often don't appreciate the skill development of the digital generation, skills that they have honed to perfection after years of trial and error practice. What we tend to forget is that the reason our boys have different skills and literacies is that they have developed them out of necessity so that they are able to operate in a digital world. Their skill development is different because their focus is different. Instead of acknowledging the value of their digital literacy, we instead complain about the skills they don't have. Because digital isn't our native language, and because we are immigrants to their world, many of us feel like we need to help fix them. But is fixing what they need? Or should we instead build on the new skills that they bring to the classroom? Because we were taught to value tradition, we may unconsciously believe that the skills and literacies that our boys are not as good or useful because they do not appear to value or prioritize our skills and literacies. We must realize that we are not in our world anymore, but in a new digital one. We have to accept that it's not going back to the way it was. The way boys think has been heavily influenced by this digital landscape, and they need our guidance and wisdom to help them shape the future for all of us.
Okay, and sort of continuing with this, I then address questions that are sort of particular focus for faculty to think about, and I kind of split that into two parts. I've edited this down a little bit, not just for time, but also because the audience in Australia was 2/3 of people from countries that played cricket, so there were a lot of jokes I could make about that. And here I think it's Jonathan Creamer and Malcolm Morrison, and that's it. So you're missing out on a few of those. I've saved one of them. And I'm going to talk about two particular challenges that, in keeping with the framework of the digital natives versus the digital immigrants, that I think we as faculty face, and then two particular charges that we essentially have even in that new landscape. So the first part is essentially why we might be useless, and the second part is why we are still essential. And one of the things I think that is important is that when we talk about the skills that they have, the broader category of skill that we're talking about hasn't changed necessarily all that much. In other words, this is a sort of the Bloom's taxonomy of thinking skills that's been widely cited in various books on pedagogy and classroom strategies, and there you see the skills from the 50s, and it was updated in the early 21st century, and some of the terms were changed, but they are still, at the core, recognizable skills. The difference is maybe the relative importance of each of them and how the boys acquire them, or how younger people acquire them. So the two challenges. The first, I would say, which I framed in terms of what if the knowledge is no longer as important. And the knowledge, if you were raised in London or anywhere in England, you might know that the London taxi drivers, to qualify as a licensed cab driver, you have to complete an 8-hour exam, which is known as the knowledge, and you have to spend years acquiring it. And the knowledge means that you have a map in your own head of all the major thoroughfares in London, so that if they ask you a question, how do you get from King's Cross Station to this street out in West Hounslow, you don't need to look it up. You can answer that question. This has been a part of the qualification for 150 years. London cabs have been giving exams almost as long as MBA has been giving them. This is obviously an incredibly impressive feat to learn all this stuff. The question, though, is in the age of GPS, should that really be the number one skill or qualification, or should that be the skill we spend that much time on in terms of training our cab drivers? Obviously, a basic sense of direction is helpful. GPS might not work all the time, but to have so much focus on this may be misplaced. And that can be difficult because it's obviously an incredibly impressive thing to have done, and no one wants to let go of it. And we may sometimes face that in our classrooms. The way we learned something, or the particular piece of information that we learned, may have taken us an incredibly long time, and we are extremely proud of it. But in a digital landscape, it may not be something that they need to learn to the same degree or in the same way. But it can be difficult, as I said, to let go. But we need to consider that sometimes. Is the knowledge that we are imparting and the way we're doing it still as important as it was? Second, and this can be tough just because we are the immigrants to the digital landscape, is figuring out when an innovation is a Fosbury flop or a Sinclair C5. Now, the first of these probably is widely enough known here. So the Fosbury flop, the method of doing the high jump where you went over, sort of leading with your shoulders and back rather than going over with your stomach. I think it's the 1960s that it was developed, but pretty quickly replaced like that all the older way of doing it. You weren't going to win anything if you still continue jumping the old way. So this was obviously an innovation. If you didn't adapt it, you were going to be left behind. Who here's heard of the Sinclair C5? Malcolm and Michael, that's about what I was expecting. The Sinclair C5 was the solution to London's traffic problems in the 1980s. It was well, it technically wanted to be called a car, but that was very aspirational if you take a look at it. It was launched by Sir Clive Sinclair in 1984-85, and it was brilliant for getting around as long as you didn't want to go faster than 10 miles an hour, drive for longer than 30 minutes, and it wasn't raining, which obviously in London, yes, well. So the Sinclair C5 did not sell its first line of production. But at the time, again, it was introduced as this bold new innovation that was going to change the way that transportation and traffic worked. And so one of the challenges we have is judging which innovation is going to be the right kind of flop, if you like, on the left, or the wrong kind of flop on the right, because if you embrace it, it takes a long time to change your lesson plans. It takes a long time to redesign a curriculum to incorporate a new innovation. And so figuring out ahead of time what's going to be long and lasting and worthwhile and what's going to turn out to be a one-year sort of flash in the pan can be complicated. So that, I think, is also a challenge because it makes us risk-averse to good innovations even though it makes us rightfully wary of bad ones. Okay, the other way around. Us as immigrants relative to them as natives, the question of the way they do things, it may be the way they do things best, but it may not be the best way to do things. And one example that I would use is their notion of taking notes sometimes. If a kid has missed a class and wants notes, they will often say, well, do you mind if I take a picture of Jack's notes from yesterday? And therefore, I have then taken notes. And that's very easy. That's how they record a lot of their life experiences. That's how they interact with each other. But that is not a good way of retaining information. So there are several areas, and again, for the sake of time, kind of keeping this briefer than it was at the IBSC, but there are several areas of learning where the pre-digital skill will be more effective than the digital one. And it's siphoning off which is the case and where, but we shouldn't be afraid if we feel that way to say, well, actually, the way you're doing it is not going to be as effective for what you want it to do. Not for what I once used to want it to do, but for what you will need it to do. And the second area, as again, this week, learning by doing, what if all else fails? What happens in those instances when the technology they've gotten used to just doesn't work? And this, in a sense, comes back to the taxi driver situation. You don't need someone to prioritize as their first qualification, spending 3 years learning something for an 8-hour exam that GPS will be replacing 99% of the time, but they still need to memorize some things. They still need to learn things that will be able to survive. They will be able to survive if the digital world collapses, as technology will at some point. You can rely on it being around for most of the time, and you have to adapt to that, but there will be times when it isn't. So I kind of concluded with a story of, the immigrant-native dynamic, I think, fits this whole topic pretty well. And I use as an example, the first person I was aware of as being an immigrant when I was growing up in London was my cricket coach when I was on the under-11s team. And his name was Brian Lebroy, and he was from Sri Lanka. And he'd emigrated to England in the late 50s or early 60s. And thinking about it in his terms and keeping out any larger questions about the politics or social questions surrounding immigration, if he had come from Sri Lanka to England in the 1950s and continued to dress like the weather was what it was in Colombo in Sri Lanka, he would have been in for a rude shock if he hadn't adapted to the new landscape that he was in. If he continued to just act like he'd been where we'd always been. At the same time, if he came across and there was something that he did that was better than what was going on where he was arriving, there was no reason to let go of it. So I would speak for Malcolm as well to say that, if the immigrants from South Asia arriving in England had a lot to offer us, for example, they could have seen the food we were serving and said, have you guys ever thought about flavor or spices or any of these other things that we have that we can offer you that you may not have encountered? And I think that's the kind of dynamic that we have here as well. We cannot, as Marc said, just say, well, the old landscape is still here and we're sticking to that. That's what we know. And that's the better way of doing it. Nor should we assume that just because it's an older skill, it's therefore irrelevant. We have to find that balance between adapting to the new landscape and carrying over those things that can either help us or improve it for the other people in it. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Libby Overton. I teach 7th grade. I teach both grammar and literature. So my section is talking a little bit more about what we see in the junior school, and then probably what you guys also see in the high school. So we know that our kids are on their phones all the time. Now, we face an interesting situation because in the junior school, we're particularly strict about not letting them be on their phones. So we want them to turn them off, keep them in their locker. If they have them in their backpack, they need to be off. But the thing that I think we really need to start thinking about is, well, what happens when they get home? Because they don't have the same policies at home as they may have at school. These images up here, although maybe a little bit exaggerated, are very real. The top left image is actually from a movie called 8th Grade. Nan sent out an email about it. I would highly recommend going to see it, especially if you are not familiar with Instagram and social media sites. It really gives you an insight on what an 8th grade girl's everyday life looks like. And sadly, she is constantly engaged online, and this applies to our boys as well. They all have Instagram accounts, they all have Twitter, they all text all the time, group me, all of those things that they do but a lot of times they feel very lonely and disengaged. Another thing I noticed from the video was, or from the movie, was that the daughter, so many of the things that she was doing online were, after her dad went to bed, because she has constant access. So what can we do as educators to help our students navigate their reality? First, I think that we need to make them aware. Well, let's look at this slide. So there was a study done by Dr. Larry Rosen. He is a well-known neuroscientist, and he studied, he's done many studies, but he asked how often do students switch from studying to doing something else like checking messages, texting, looking at websites. And if you look at the statistics, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders all say they do this very often. There have been studies that show they take screenshots of college kids' laptops, and the average time that a college kid spends on a link is 19 seconds. And this is while a professor is speaking, this is while they are supposedly paying attention. So what studies have shown is that kids really do multitask, and they think that they can. But I think our job as educators is to show them that while you can multitask, you can walk and eat, you can walk and talk, you can't read and talk. You can't read and text. And there have been studies that the younger the generation is, the more confident they are in their ability to really do things all at once. So many of our students will think that of course, they can do their homework, they can have their phone out, they can be texting, they can do all of these things at once. But I would suggest you try, and I'm planning to do this on one of my first days of school, try just a simple activity with them. So if they try to count from 1 to 26 and then recite A to Z, you can do it in groups, have them time each other, see how long it takes if you add up that time, and then ask them to do it alternating and see how long that takes them. If they do it, If they do it, they'll probably realize that it takes them a lot longer when they're task switching than it would have if they had just completed one task in a row. And what our boys don't have is time to waste. They are constantly scheduled, they are here, they're at their sports, they come home, and so we really need to do the best we can to empower them to utilize their tools. And one thing that they may not be good at is organizing themselves, especially in the junior school. So what can we do to help them? We can at least increase their awareness that you actually may not be as good at multitasking as you think you are. You're actually losing at least 30 seconds at a minimum every time you switch back and forth. Another thing I think would be really helpful is those first two questions I actually give as a questionnaire at the beginning of school. I ask my students to think about where they study, why they pick that place and have a very kind of constant routine. Well, I've never even thought about incorporating questions about what they do with their phones, what they do with their computers, but I do think we need to start thinking about that. And also, the boys know they can't have their phones in class, so why are they in their backpack? Why are they in their pocket, right? Let's think about just being a little bit more aware of what they are doing with their phones. I think the other thing that we all know is that even though we don't want them to be on their phones at school, they all are on their phones. And we do such a great job of encouraging our boys to be gentlemen and scholars and athletes. But I think we should think a little bit about how we encourage our boys to be gentlemen, scholars, and athletes online as well. And think a little bit about digital citizenship. And I know we've already started talking about that. And Our guidance counseling has done a really good job of bringing that up, but I think we all should be aware of what our kids and what our students are doing online, because they do represent us, whether it's here on campus or in cyberspace. They are representing MBA. So just a few things to think about as we realize that these boys have their phones. They're really addicted to their phones, so we can't ignore it. And this is a shortened version of kind of what we talked about at IBSC, but that's my part. I'm finished. Thank you.